Welcome, dear viewer. Welcome to MOBY-DICK Abridged, or who cares what Eli thinks about Moby-Dick. This is episode 7, which means we will be covering chapter 7, The Chapel. I, as always, am your host, Eli, who cares what I think, and I'm really excited about this chapter. It's another short one, but I promise no horseshit in this episode because while short, this chapter really packs a fucking wallop. In the last chapter, Ishmael and Queequeg went out for a walk after breakfast, a morning constitutional, as it were. And Ishmael told us how New Bedford is just a fucking crazy place, unique even among seaports for its outlandishness. In the last episode, Ishmael took us to the streets. In this one, he takes us to church. The chapter begins with Ishmael mentioning that in New Bedford, which he has just, in the previous chapter, described in very flowery language, literally, with much flower talk. In New Bedford, there is a whaleman's chapel, which most all fishermen, bound shortly for the Indian or the Pacific, make a point of getting over to on Sunday before they leave, and Ishmael is no different. You remember, because he wants to do all the, traditional steps of the whaling voyage according to this, mythology that Melville is establishing. Anyway, he heads back to the Spouter Inn after his morning constitutional with Queequeg, and presumably they part ways, but that's not mentioned, and we'll see why it's sort of unclear in a little bit, but for now, the weather. You see, dear viewer, when the weather is good in a book, that usually represents that the character is feeling good. And when it's bad, well, you get the idea. The sky, Ishmael tells us, had changed from clear, sunny cold to driving sleet and mist. So that's pretty fucking dramatic as far as weather changes go. Clear and sunny cold to driving sleet and low visibility, foggy mist. I picture the spray from Niagara Falls when he says that, driving sleet and mist. Or Silent Hill or something, whatever it is. It's far less welcoming than clear and sunny cold, isn't it? So Ishmael puts on his shaggy bearskin jacket, which he points out is made of a cloth called bearskin, which leads me to believe that it's not the actual skin of a bear. Okay, y'all, I found on powermobydick.com, which is a pretty dope website. You should check it out if you have any interest in the book. That bearskin is a coarse, shaggy woolen cloth used for overcoats. And now we know. Anyway, he puts on his overcoat and struggles through the storm to the chapel. Once inside, he sees a small collection of people that are spread out among the pews. Sailors and sailors' wives and widows, he tells us, and all silent. The only sounds are the occasional shrieks of the storm outside. Everyone is seemingly sitting apart on purpose, as if their grief were insular and incommunicable, he tells us. And the chaplain isn't there yet, so everyone is reading these marble tablets that are affixed to the walls. Ishmael mentions 3 of them, but does so in a really irreverent and casual way. 3 of them ran something like the following, but I do not pretend to quote. Comes off as pretty aloof and maybe not such a kind person there, I'm not sure. He's often rather aloof and irreverent, but callous doesn't come to mind when I think of him that much. It's an interesting choice, especially given that he certainly seems to have captured the essence of the tablets pretty faithfully. You'll have to be the judge of that yourself, dear viewer. Sacred to the memory of John Talbot, who at the age of 18 was lost overboard near the Isle of Desolation off Patagonia. November 1st, 1836. This tablet is erected to his memory by his sister. And then, sacred to the memory of Robert Long, Willis Ellery, Nathan Coleman, Walter Canny, Seth Macy, and Samuel Gleig, forming one of the boat's crews of the ship Eliza, who were towed out of sight by a whale on the offshore ground in the Pacific December 31st, 1839. This marble is here placed by their surviving shipmates. And finally, sacred to the memory of the late Captain Ezekiel Hardy, who in the bows of his boat was killed by a sperm whale on the coast of Japan, August 3rd, 1833. This tablet is erected to his memory by his widow. So after seeing and hearing those, do you see what I mean when I say it's an odd thing to say that he's not quoting the tablets? Like, what did you leave out? What did you leave up to artistic liberty there, Ishmael? Can you imagine, dear viewer, if I claimed that I was just paraphrasing those, that I didn't copy the capitalization or the line breaks or the italics from the book? I just made it up. And why include details at all if you just made it up? The whole thing is bizarre, but he did it, and it's done. And we need to move on with our lives, for God's sake. But before we do, the second one is fucking crazy, so let's just think about that one for a second. Those 6 dudes were towed out of sight by a whale. That is fucking terrifying. I'm not sure if I'd rather be eaten by a sperm whale or drowned by a sperm whale, but both sound like shitty deaths. In any event, Ishmael shakes the icy sleet off his hat and coat and boots and sits down on a seat near the door and finds, to his great surprise, Queequeg sitting next to him with a wondrous gaze of incredulous curiosity on his face. Remember how I said it's weird that they don't mention them like splitting up and then it would become strange? Like, did Queequeg just like run ahead of him through the sleet and so he didn't notice him going there? How did he not know he was there? I don't understand. They like went back to the inn and then to the same place, but he is surprised to see him. Anyway, a little weird. Queequeg, of course, can't read English. Or possibly any language. For all we know, we have no direct evidence that I can remember of him reading in the book. In any language. But he's not reading the inscriptions. That's for sure. But he's not a fucking Martian, you know? He's a human being. So he can tell that everyone who is reading the plaques is being strongly affected by them. Ishmael guesses from the looks on their faces that many of these women gathered here are widows of the men whose names are on the stones. Ishmael talks about the looks on these people's faces and how they seem to wear the trappings of some unceasing grief. And he says this: "Oh, ye whose dead lie buried beneath the green grass, who standing among flowers can say, Here, here lies my beloved. Ye know not the desolation that broods in bosoms like these. What bitter blanks in those black-bordered marbles which cover no ashes. What despair in those immovable inscriptions, what deadly voids and unbidden infidelities in the lines that seem to gnaw upon all faith, and refuse resurrections to the beings who have placelessly perished without a grave. As well might those tablets stand in the cave of Elephanta as here." So first of all, the cave of Elephanta is an allusion to this cave on Garapuri Island? Don't know. Off the coast of Mumbai, India, which contains rock-cut temples and sculptures dedicated to the worship of Shiva, the god of destruction. So I think what he's saying here is that to be buried at sea in whatever way, to be eaten by a whale, to have your ship sunk, to die at sea and never be brought home, is worse than to die. Invoking Shiva here implies to me that to die at sea isn't simply to die, it is to be destroyed, annihilated even. And this robs those left behind of the solace that comes from a resting place for their loved one. From here, Ishmael muses on our fear of death, but fear isn't the only thing that comes from death. Faith, like a jackal, feeds among the tombs, and even from these dead doubts she gathers her most vital hope. Faith, like a jackal, feeds among the tombs. What a fucking line. It's so good. And it brings up that same irreverent attitude I was talking about earlier. Ishmael is actually a lot more critical of religion, like in general, but more specifically Puritanism, than I would expect from a person living in the 1850s, as we'll see repeatedly further on in the story. But religious critique or stylish aphorisms, he seems to be right. Man's struggle with his own mortality does appear to be the source of religion. Faith, like a jackal, feeds among the tombs. I love it. There's only one paragraph left in the chapter, and I'm just going to read the whole thing to you. We'll discuss it after. It needs scarcely to be told with what feelings on the eve of a Nantucket voyage I regarded those marble tablets, and by the murky light of that darkened, doleful day read the fate of the whalemen who had gone before me. Yes, Ishmael, the same fate may be thine. But somehow I grew merry again. Delightful inducements to embark, fine chance for promotion, it seems. Aye, a stove boat will make me an immortal by brevet. Yes, there is death in this business of whaling, a speechlessly quick, chaotic bounding of a man into eternity. But what then? Methinks we have hugely mistaken this matter of life and death. Methinks that what they call my shadow here on earth is my true substance. Methinks that in looking at things spiritual, we are too much like oysters observing the sun through the water and thinking that thick water the thinnest of air. Methinks my body is but the lees of my better being. In fact, take my body who will. Take it, I say. It is not me. And therefore 3 cheers for Nantucket. And come a stove boat and stove body when they will, for stave my soul Jove himself cannot. A lot going on there. But we're going to break it down. A lot going on there. We're going to break it down, but let's just admire it for a second. This paragraph perfectly exemplifies why this is my favorite book, which is the same reason it's almost impossible to pitch this book to someone. It's not really about what it's about, which is probably true for most great novels, but like the best bits of Moby-Dick are these little musings Melville gives us about what it is to be a person. The story could literally be about anything, and those musings would be right at home. In any case, he starts out by saying, yeah, obviously he was feeling pretty freaked out by these tablets at first. He was just about to head to Nantucket to catch a whaling ship himself, and a reading about what happened to those men forced him to admit that the same fate might await him. But then his mood started to brighten again for some reason. He says, a stove boat, which means a boat like bashed in or bashed to pieces by a whale. Stove means bashed in, basically. A stove boat will make me an immortal by brevet. Brevet? Or is it brevet? I don't know. Anyway, it's a type of military promotion that raises an officer's rank, but not their pay, and is usually given for bravery. So he's saying basically, at least he can die heroically and do something worth remembering. So there's death in whaling. So what? Then what? Remember how I said Melville is pretty critical of religion, especially for his time? Well, this last bit of the chapter, I think, really proves my point. He's straight up rejecting the theology of Christianity. Methinks we have hugely mistaken this matter of life and death. You get burned at the stake in some periods of history just for saying that. Methinks that what they call my shadow here on earth is my true substance. Almost brings Jung and like the shadow self and all that stuff to mind, but Jung was born in 1865. So Melville certainly wasn't referring to his work with this line, but perhaps these ideas were like already just in the zeitgeist of the end of the 19th century, and Jung simply plucked them out of the collective unconscious. Who knows? Either way, it's a fucking sick line. What they call my shadow here on Earth also kind of implies some other location, doesn't it? Where they have like true knowledge of such things, which is fucking awesome. Myth thinks that in looking at things spiritual, we are too much like oysters observing the sun through the water and thinking that thick water the thinnest of air. This one is probably my favorite. It's got that wonderful watery imagery that fits the story that we're in so well, but it also implies that we, the oysters in this analogy, have the potential to be forming a pearl, something precious within us, which is just so beautiful, if you ask me. It reminds me of that part also in Game of Thrones when Robb tells Bran that old Nan once told him that the sky is blue because we live inside the eye of a blue-eyed giant. And Bran's like, maybe we do. Cool response. Probably what Ishmael would have said. I think they say the name of the supposed giant, but I can't remember it. If you know it, please tell me in the comments. You can even make one up if you don't know it. I don't give a shit. I'll start. Squaggleworth Featherfanny. That's it, I think, actually. I can hear Richard Madden saying it in my head. But still, feel free to suggest your own. Methinks my body is but the lees of my better being. The lees, in case you don't know, are the dregs or residue. Think of the sediment at the bottom of a wine barrel, that undissolved powder that you couldn't get mixed into your workout drink. In fact, take my body who will. Take it, I say, it's not me. And therefore 3 cheers for Nantucket. And come a stove boat and stove body when they will, for stave my soul Jove himself cannot. That last bit has almost a poetic cadence, but I'm no expert on such things. It certainly has a distinct sort of palette of sounds that it seems to highlight. Come a stove boat and stove body, for stave my soul Jove himself. I don't know, those parts seem like they relate to each other on a level like beneath their definitions, the shapes of the words, their feelings in the mouth. They seem kind of similar. I don't know. It's something like what we discussed a little bit in episode 0 about words and their meanings being distinct but connected. We quoted a guy who mentioned Jacob Grimm and the link between words and their meanings. I don't know. Anyways, I'm not really sure if they're meant to be connected, if it's just me, but to me, that last sentence like leaps off of the page and just feels really special. And also, it's super defiant. For stave my soul, Jove himself cannot. Stave, by the way, is the present tense version of stove. So instead of bashed in, it would be bash in. So it's like, for bash in my soul, Jove himself cannot. So like, the big cheese, king of the gods, can't destroy my soul. Even if my family doesn't know where my body is, fuck that. They're just oysters looking up at the sun. They think it's in the water with them because they don't know about the sky. And that's how the chapter ends. What a statement. Even God can't destroy my soul, can't annihilate my soul. It's a pretty affirmative statement, isn't it? Hopeful, even in the face of certain doom. Taking life as it comes, it's comforting somehow, at least to me. Hopefully to you. And that concludes our discussion, dear viewer, of Chapter 7 of Moby-Dick, The Chapel. I hope you'll join us next time for Chapter 8, The Pulpit. Thank you, dear viewer, for watching Moby-Dick Abridged, or who cares what Eli thinks about Moby-Dick. I, as always, have been Eli. Who cares what I think? Adios, muchachos.